So maybe you want a QHD phone with a good camera and decent specs, but you don't want to dish out the £600 or £700 for a new one. Hey guys, it's Ryan Thomas for Failtech here, and I may or may not have an answer to your question. So before I get started, a lot of people have commented saying that there's a boot loop problem with the G4, not just the G2 and G3. So there is a problem there, but I've never had an issue with it, and neither has my friend who's owned theirs for a while, so I can't comment on it. All I can say is that if you buy a G4, you'll have the possibility of having a bricked phone due to the boot loop. It might not happen when you first buy it, but it might happen over time. Similarly, knocks on the SX Edge can have a huge impact by not letting you use the phone if you try to install a custom ROM or root your phone. RIP Seb, my mate, who had this happen to him. As long as you keep with stock software though, you should be alright with the SX Edge. These phones are from March and April of 2015, and so you're getting phones that are coming up to 2 years old. But you're not missing out on all the features, at least not on the SX Edge, and you're getting quite a lot of phone for your money compared to the modern phones that do a similar thing for a higher price. Remember though, these two were top of their game 2 years ago. They cost upwards of 500 quid at the time, but how do they fare up now? Well, if we're on topic of price, the G4 will cost you a cool £220 for a good one off of eBay. That means a brand new or close to. The SX Edge is coming up at £320, but you can pick up the non-Edge for slightly less than that, and all you're missing out on is the Edge feature. I use eBay for my prices because the site is ubiquitous across a load of countries, so it's available across a load of countries, and it's a good way of saving you money there sometimes, at least sometimes. I would call these mid-range phones for mid-range money. It's a place in the market where phones are missing from actually. You almost have to buy used to get this kind of quality at this kind of price. Let's get into the actual phones. You're getting two very contrasting designs with two Korean X powerhouses. The G4 is an almost rectangular squared off design on the front and the sides with a curved back. The back can be changed with LG's first party backs with plastic and leather available to drastically change the way the phone feels and looks in your hand. The nav buttons are software based, and you have rear placed volume and lock buttons which switch things up compared to Samsung's unit. Talking of the SX Edge, the design is completely different with more rounded corners, a proper wedge feel with its sweepingly curved edge glass pieces, and more glass and metal rails. Along with this comes a camera bump that is not found on the G4, as well as a fingerprint scanner and home button up front with nav buttons flanking its off-screen and traditional side-mounted lock and volume buttons, along with a heart rate monitor on the back. I'd say you're getting more of a familiar design with the SX Edge due to its button placement and its design. However, you could argue that it's less ergonomic than the G4. Yes, the SX Edge is smaller and more malleable, manipulable in your hand, but it's sharper and less comfortable to grip in long periods of time compared to its rival. The G4 has a more curved back and seems more comfortable and ergonomic to hold for long periods of time. Maybe it's just the materials that they're made of, but of course you are getting a bigger phone here, so you've got to watch out for that if you've got small hands. The SX Edge is predominantly made of glass and metal, which on the face of things seems like a much better selection of materials over the G4. But it's cold to the touch in the morning and it feels quite fragile, as my mate Joe discovered, with cracked glass everywhere on it. With the G4 having plastic pretty much everywhere, it implies the phone is worth less money, which in this case is true. Also, although the G4's plastic can be dinged up, it doesn't have that precious glass on both sides that can shatter, which means you have to weigh up whether you want the more ergonomic phone that's less likely to break in the G4, or the more classy and expensive feeling phone that can shatter. Oddly enough, I prefer the design of the SX Edge despite its not entirely ideal form factor and ergonomics, and precious build quality actually. You're getting a QHD screen whether you go with the SX Edge or the G4. The G4 gives you a traditional flat panel QHD IPS Plus display with a 5.5 inch form factor and on-screen buttons, and Samsung gives you a 5.1 inch QHD Super AMOLED display on the SX Edge, which has a better panel in my opinion. I like the fact that you get more pixel dense display with the SX Edge, but the Edge display can get annoying. It's not a huge inconvenience, but it does add about £50 to the price tag here in the UK, along with more angles to crack the glass, and the fact that if you have small hands, it makes one-handed use really annoying because you can accidentally touch the edge with your palm. Both displays are incredibly crisp and give great images. The colours seem more poppy on the SX Edge, but maybe that's due to the AMOLED display, and they look more realistic on the G4. I personally prefer the AMOLED display because I'm a huge advocate for OLED displays everywhere where you can turn off pixels when they're not needed. On paper, the specs are very similar for these two beasts in terms of the camera. They both feature 16 megapixel sensors with wide apertures and are both able to shoot UHD video at 30 FPS and slow motion at 120 FPS. They both have optical image stabilization and they both produce good looking images. Maybe scratch that, great looking images. I think it's hard to pick between the two here, and honestly, they both outshone their competitors and they both stood out as excellent camera phones at the time, with great manual video settings too. The autofocus on the G4 seems a tad quicker, but apart from that, they are both incredible in good light and even quite decent in low light too. Note here that the S6 Edge has a camera bump where the G4 hasn't. Maybe it's a concern for you. For the front-facing cameras, you have a choice between a 5MP super wide angle lens on the S6 Edge versus the 8MP not as wide on the G4. You have to pick between the wider angle lens on the S6 Edge versus the higher resolution and arguably better quality on the G4. Both are able to shoot 1080p at 30 FPS, so you can get some okay selfie video, but it's not the greatest in the world. The performance is where these two shone in their heyday, with the LG G4 rocking a controversial Snapdragon 8086 core with 3GB of RAM and 32GB of storage with the ability to expand, whereas Samsung chose the in-house for their CPU, which is an Exynos 7420 8-core CPU with 3GB of RAM and either 32, 64 or 128GB storage with no expandability, unfortunately. Everyday performance was good and still is good with these phones, with the ability to run through your typical social media apps without any problems. The same could be said for emails and even playing games, consuming media, stuff like that. These two Korean X flagships hold up really well and have aged well with the software still available. According to GSM Arena, which is where I get all of my statistics, guys, just letting you know that, both phones started off life with Android 5.0 Lollipop, and both are able to be OTA, that's over the air, updated to 6.0 Marshmallow. Both versions of Android are pretty heavily skinned by Samsung and LG, with the ability to utilize their features such as the double tap to wake on the G4, as well as being able to utilize the fingerprint scanner and heart rate monitor on the S6 Edge. Putting your own choice of software is definitely an option on the G4 if you know what you're doing, but it's a bit more of a challenge on the S6 Edge due to the knock system that Samsung imposes. The problem is that I've seen knocks kick in firsthand with my mate Seb having a problem, which resulted in him having a bricked phone, which is completely useless to him. This usually happens when you try to root and install custom software on these devices, so I heavily recommend not doing that, even if you really know what you're doing. The S6 Edge features a 2600 mAh non-removable battery that can get you around 3 to 4 hours of screen on time, apparently, and will last longer with a few tricks like switching backgrounds and themes to black so the pixels don't have to get lit, a feature of OLED and why I advocate it. The phone should give you a full day of use with steady use, but it can also leave you with 5 to 6 hours left of the day with 0% battery life. It all depends on what you do, but I'd call this one of the weaker batteries, and it's a shame because you can't upgrade it or expand it easily like you can with the G4. Speaking of the devil, the LG device has a 3000 mAh battery that can be upgraded with an external battery pack if you so desire, and the battery life is better from personal experience, but it's still not the best and degrades massively as any battery would. Like I said, you can expand it with a battery pack, and so you can get more out of your phone if you choose to go down that route, and if you buy either of these phones used, then this is the best way to go because you can actually change that used battery out, which you cannot do with the S6 Edge. On stock battery and stock software, it got me through a full day with no issues. I really did like the battery on the G4. The speakers aren't the best with these phones, with the G4 featuring a decently loud but distorted rear speaker versus the S6 Edge's bottom firing affair that I argue is better and easier to cut toward you, so it sounds less distorted. Both devices also feature headphone jacks and Bluetooth, so I'd recommend using either of those with some external headphones, speakers, something like that for a better experience, whether it's watching or listening. Unfortunately, neither of these devices come with Type-C and have a micro USB 2.0 connector, which I like because the cables are easy and cheap to find, but there's no Type-C, so no new technology unfortunately. Expansion is something that's fluctuating with Samsung devices. The S5 had microSD, the S6 and S6 Edge did not have microSD, and then the S7 and S7 Edge did have it again. That's right, the S6 Edge doesn't have microSD expansion, which is a shame because it's at that awkward stage in the middle of the Samsung flagships. On the other hand, the G4 does have microSD expansion, and it's a dream. So rounding up then, do I recommend either of these phones? I do recommend the G4, and I know I'm going to get absolutely plastered in the comments for this because they say that there's a huge boot loop problem, and yes, there is a boot loop problem. I'm not denying that. I just cannot find, from first-hand experience, I just haven't seen it, but I have seen it with my other phones, so I can kind of tell how annoying that is. And I do recommend the G4 because of its screen and its camera and its battery life, and the fact that you can change the battery at all. But I don't recommend it over the fact that you haven't actually got a fingerprint scanner or anything like that kind of modern on it. Compared to the S6 Edge, which does have all the features of basically the S7 Edge minus that microSD expansion. I do actually recommend the S6 Edge over it, as long as you try not to change the software. I know TouchWiz can be annoying, but you are going to brick your phone, or very, very likely to brick your phone if you try to install custom software on this thing. It just happens. I've seen it firsthand. It's really not good because you're left with a £350 phone that is completely useless. So yes, I would recommend the S6 Edge over the G4. Personally, I just prefer the feel of it, the fact that it's made of glass. I do like the feel of that. I've got it on my S7 Edge. I just love it. I like the ergonomics of it. It's not the best, it's not as good as the G4, but it's still quite good, and I do like having that fingerprint scanner on the front. And the fact that yes, it does have a fingerprint scanner. The fingerprint scanner is almost a make or break thing for me, as it is for quite a lot of people buying phones at this price range, so I would recommend the S6 Edge. Also, it's kind of nice, if you really wanted the bigger screen, you can always go with the S6 Edge Plus, which I believe ups the battery life as well, which is quite good, but I really haven't dabbled in that, so I cannot tell you. All I can say is I love my S7 Edge, and I did like the S6 Edge, so there's my advocation right there. Alright guys, so this has been my video of the S6 Edge versus the LG G4 in 2017. I hope you guys are enjoying this new phone content, and I will see you in the next video. So like if you enjoyed it, dislike it if you didn't enjoy it, subscribe if you're new, never to miss a video like this one, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.